How you doing there? Welcome back to Babble on Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Vav, Daf 106 of Masechta Chullin. Friends, Daf 106 is, in my opinion, a very interesting daf. Excuse me. There are certain kind of it's interesting. Maybe because it's interesting in a dry way in some ways. That there are like small practical things on this daf, which is I think what makes it interesting. There are things that we'll be able to take away with us that are just kind of practical takeaways. We're gonna have a little bit of Shulchan Aruch, some Malachot L'Maaseh in this daf. So related to washing hands and Netilas Yadayim. So in my opinion, I thought it was really fascinating. The truth is there are things probably that for years and years and years I was kind of waiting to learn this daf. I'll just give you one example. For example, Anoto Yodav Leperis Einu Elu Migase Aruach. I never quite understood why that was, that somebody washes their hands for fruits is considered haughty. Like what about that specifically? Anyways, whatever, that's one example. There's some really interesting nukudot, some interesting points on this daf that I think makes it interesting. So there are 4 sections on the daf. The first one is related to plunging your hands in water, which I find very interesting. Right? I think almost exclusively probably washing our hands with cups is probably our main way of washing before bread or whatever. The fact of the matter is you can plunge your hands into a mikveh. That also works. Now, usually we don't have a mikveh in our kitchens or whatever it is, or we're not necessarily by a river. But we're going to learn about plunging your hands into a river, into a spring, into a mikveh. We will learn about the reason for washing our hands for bread. The truth is we discussed it a little bit yesterday, but we will discuss it in the Gemara today. Washing our hands for fruit, as I just mentioned a few minutes ago, and how to wash our hands until, how much of the hand needs to be washed also. So I think very kind of, nothing like so like, fancy and exciting in that grandiose sense, but very practical and I think therefore interesting topics on today's daf. So come join me. Let's have a great time learning Daf Kuf Vav, Daf 106 of Masechta Chullin. Friends, we begin on Daf Kuf Vav, Amid Aleph. 3 lines into the Amid. Ki also Rav Dimi, when Rav Dimi came from Eretz Yisrael to Babel Amar, he said, Maim ha Rishonim he'achilu b'sar chazir. The way I understand the technical, whatever. Maim Rishonim he'achilu. I think he'achilu was talking about the mayim, maybe. He's talking about the water. That, I don't know, but I don't think it really matters how we get into the technicalities of how to explain it, but I think maybe it means that the Maim Rishonim were responsible for feeding a Yid pork. Acharonim etziu es aish mibayla, and Maim Acharonim were responsible for a woman getting divorced. Okay, let's talk about that for a second. What does it mean that Maim Rishonim were responsible for feeding a Yid pork? Basically, there was some Yid, and this Yid owned a restaurant, and he had an interesting kind of way of doing things, which were, if a Yid entered the restaurant, he would feed him kosher food. If a non-Yid entered the restaurant, he would feed him pork. How would he know who's Jewish and who's not? Well, his criteria was who is washing their hands before eating bread. Those who washed their hands before eating bread, Maim Rishonim, were Jewish and were fed kosher meat. Those who did not were considered not Jewish and fed pork. So Maim Rishonim were responsible for feeding a Yid pork. A Yid came in, did not wash Maim Rishonim, so he was fed pork. Okay. And what's the situation of a woman getting divorced? That relates to a story, a maaseh, in Masechta Yoma and Daf Pei Gimel, I believe. A maaseh with, I think it was Reb Meir, Reb Yehuda, and Reb Yossi. They were traveling and they needed to stop off at a krechmer for the night, or in this case actually for, I believe, a Shabbos. And the name of the krechmer owner, his name was Kedor. And Reb Meir says, I don't like the name, I don't like the sound of that name, Kedor, because the pasuk says, I believe this is from Parshas nitzavim, which is coming up in the next few weeks. Kidor tapuchos hema banim lo emum bum or something. That this is a generation of topsy-turvies, of like flipping around, I guess. Anyways, of chaos, I guess. So Kidor, Reb Meir had an association of Kidor Tapuchos Hema. Reb Meir says, I'm not going to give him, I guess, the equivalent of the safe. They didn't have a safe in the room necessarily. You would give your possessions for safekeeping by the owner of the Kretschmer. Reb Meir says, I'm not going to give my possessions for safekeeping. Anyways, Reb Yehuda and Reb Yossi gave their possessions to Kidor for safekeeping over Shabbos. When they asked for them back, Kidor says, I don't know what you are talking about. And they were like, okay, we don't know what to do now. But they noticed that Kidor had in his mustache, some of his lunch was left over in his mustache. He ate lentils for lunch. So they had an idea. They were going to go to his wife and say, your husband sent us to retrieve our valuables from you. And the sign that he gave us, so that you know that he's the one who sent us, is we know what you had for lunch. It was lentils. She says, oh, okay, who else would know what we had for lunch? He must have really sent them, and they got their valuables back. And of course, when Kidor found out what happened, he got very upset with his wife. How could she have given their valuables back to their rightful owners? And for that reason, she received a divorce. So therefore, Maim Rishonim were responsible for feeding a Yid pork. Maim Acharonim were responsible for someone getting divorced. So again, Kios Rav Dimi, when Rav Dimi came from Eretz Yisrael to Babble, Amr, he says, Maim Rishonim Hechilu B'sar Chazer. Maim Rishonim were responsible for feeding a Yid pork. Acharonim, Maim Acharonim Hotziu Esa Isha Mibayla were responsible for a woman getting divorced. Kios Ravin, when Ravin came, he had the same premise but slight changes in the details. Amar Rishonim Hechilu B'sar Nevela, that on account of Maim Rishonim, a Yid was fed Nevela. Acharonim Hargu Es HaNefesh, and what happened in the Maim Acharonim case was that he ended up killing his wife, Shish, because she returned the valuables to the rightful owners. And the way to remember who says what, also Rav Dimi, when Rav Dimi came first, so Apka, the husband, right, Kidor, divorced his wife. Also Ravin, when Ravin subsequently came, Katla, Kidor then killed his wife. Kidor, you can't kill and then divorce, but you can divorce and then kill. So when Rav Dimi initially came, his version was the divorce version. When Ravin subsequently came, his version was the kill version. Rab Abba Masni Chada Me'ani V'Chada Me'ani L'Chumra. Rab Abba, his version of the events was that there was the Maim Rishonim portion and the Maim Acharonim portion. Each one, he took the more stringent version. So by the Maim Rishonim, he said that a Yid was fed pork, which is more stringent than just nevela, because pork is nevela and it's not kosher. And when it came to Kidor, his version was the killing version, and that is why, and that's l'chumra. So Gevol dig. Okay, fine. Maim Rishonim, Maim Acharonim. Now, we are going to get into now the topic of plunging your hands into water, which I think is fascinating, because I think just practically speaking, because we probably are accustomed to growing up with kitchens and plumbing and sinks and cups that we can just fill up with water and pour over our hands, I think that we just associate, well, before you eat bread, you wash your hands from a cup. I'm simply not really familiar with the possibility of you can just stick your hands into a river and that's completely fine. That's foreign to me because I don't do it ever. And it never really struck me as oh, that's also an option, but it is. From what I can tell, it is very much an option, right? Just like you can go to the mikvah in a river or a spring or a mikvah, you can also stick your hands in there as well. Now, practically speaking, in our kitchens, we don't have something that would qualify as a mikvah or a ma'ayan. So we fill up a cup with water and we do netilas yadayim that way. But you can also just plunge your hands into something that would be kosher to go to mikveh in, and that's completely acceptable. Imar was stated, Chamei or when it comes to boiled water, Chizkiah Amar Einot L'mayim Le'adayim. Chizkiah says you can't use boiling water for Mayim Rishonim. Rabbi Yochanan Amar, right? So Chizkiah says you can't. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Notlin Mayim Le'adayim, and Rabbi Yochanan says you can. You can even use boiling water for Mayim Rishonim. Amar Rabbi Yochanan says Rabbi Yochanan Sha'alt is Rabban Gamliel Bino Shel Rabbi, says Rabbi Yochanan, I asked Rabban Gamliel, Rabbi Yudah Nasi's son, Rabbi's son, Rochel Tyrus, and he was a person who eats tyrus, who eats things they have to be pure for. So he's a person who would be familiar with what you are allowed to use for washing your hands. V'amrli kol gedolei galil osin kain, and says Rabbi Yochanan that Rabbi Gamliel ben Shel Rebbe reported to him that the Gedolim, the great sages of the Galilee, would in fact wash their hands with water that was boiled, and that was completely acceptable. Chamei Tveria. What about the Chamei Tveria? The Chamei Tveria are the hot springs of Tiberias, and as Rashi points out, you see what's different about the hot springs of Tiberias as opposed to hot water that's been boiled is that hot water that's been boiled is water that was initially not boiled and was initially just room temperature or whatever, and then you boiled it. Whereas Chamei Tveria, they're hot springs. They're just inherently hot. They never were not hot. They're never going to be not hot. So the thing is, washing our hands for bread is a takana d'Rabbanan that we're going to learn about a little bit later on, but we've already talked about it in the past, right? That the Rabbanan instituted that you should wash your hands before bread, because Stam Yadayim Shniosein, and as a precaution for Truma. Anyways, we'll get to that soon. It's going to come up in our Gemara. But the whole idea of Netilas Yadayim, of filling up a cup with water and pouring it over your hands before eating, is a din d'Rabbanan. And as Rashi says, I'm going to read a Rashi a bit further down on the page. Takun Rabbanan Netila Lab Bichamin Takun. I'm reading from the Rashi, the Ramaskal D'Chuli Al Ma'asar. It comes up later on, but it's practical for now already. So the Takun Rabbanan Netila, when the rabbis instituted Netilas Yadayim, Lab Bichamin Takun, they didn't institute it with hot water, and the Chamei Tveria is hot water. Vani griye michamei or the Chamei Tveria are worse than water that's been boiled. Shelo shasa kosher, because the Chamei Tveria never had a point in which they were cold water. Right. So again, the rabbis did not when they established Netilas Yadayim, they did not establish it for hot water. They established it for cold water, for room temperature water, not for hot water. Now, water that has been boiled, well, at least initially it was not boiled, and it was initially considered kosher. So even when it's boiled, it's still acceptable. Chamei Tveria are inherently hot and therefore are unusable for Netilas Yadayim. Chapesh look at tea, and we're going to move forward on our analysis of Chamei Tveria. So says the Gemara that when it comes to Chamei Tveria, Chizkiah Amar Ein Notlen Meim Liyadayim. Chizkiah says you're not allowed to do Netilas Yadayim. You can't take a cup, fill it up with water from the Chamei Tveria, and wash Netilas Yadayim. As we just said in Rashi, that Netilas Yadayim is not with hot water. Matbilin Boina Yadayim, but you could plunge your hands into the Chamei Tveria. After all, you can go to the mikvah in Chamei Tveria. It's a spring. You can go to the mikveh in the Chamei Tveria, so you can plunge your hands into the Chamei Tveria as well. Rabbi Yochanan Amar, Rabbi Yochanan says, Kol gufo tovel ba'in. Yes, you can dip your whole body in. It's kosher for a mikvah, but avalo panav yodav v'raglav, but not your. So it says your hands, your face, hands, and feet. As Rashi points out later, the fact of the matter is, all that's interesting for us is your hands. We mention hands, face, and feet because panav yodav v'raglav kind of go together. But really, what we care about is hands. So I'll probably just, even when it says panav yodav v'raglav, I'll really just focus on the hands. Now, so let's go weiter for again. Bum, 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 bum. Okay, fine. Let's go. No, I don't want to go weiter for a second. I want to explain stuff outside that we're about to see inside. Basically, I just want to point out Rabbi Yochanan and Chizkiah. So Chizkiah had said that you're not allowed to do netilas yadayim. Chizkiah says you're not allowed to do netilas yadayim with water from the Chametz Tiveria. He didn't say anything about going to the mikveh, right? Again, let's read it again. Chizkiah Amar, Einotnin mem yadayim. You can't do netilas yadayim with them. Havamatbilin ben yadayim, but you can plunge your hands in them. He didn't say anything about going to the mikveh in them. He says you're not allowed to do netilas yadayim. You are allowed to plunge your hands in, however. He didn't say anything about going to the mikveh in it, like your whole body. Rabbi Yochanan Amar kol gufo tov ben. Rabbi Yochanan says you're allowed to dip your whole body in the mikveh. It's kosher for as a mikveh. Now, he doesn't say anything about using a cup and doing netilas yadayim with them. And then he says, but not your hands. So what I want to point out, and the Gemara is going to point out in a minute, but before the Gemara does, I want to. Everybody agrees, right? I mean, Rabbi Yochanan didn't say anything about netilas yadayim. Chizkiah didn't say anything about going to the mikveh, your whole body. However, they both agree regarding that. Everyone agrees that you can't do netilas yadayim with the water from the Chametz Tiveria, as Rashi pointed out, that it's hot water, and the Gezer and the Takanas Chachamim excluded hot water. You can't do netilas yadayim, fill up a cup and wash your hands from the Chametz Tiveria. Everyone also agrees that you're allowed to go to the mikveh in the Chametz Tiveria. It's a spring, it's a proper mikveh. Chizkiah agrees with that as well. That what they disagree about is plunging your hands into the mikveh, and we're going to have to understand what the argument is about. Now, says the Gemara, Hashta, the Gemara asks, Kol gufo tova b'hem, paniv yadav raglav lo kol sheken. The Gemara asks against Rabbi Yochanan. The Gemara requests clarification from Rabbi Yochanan because his shita seems to not make sense. If the Chametz Tiveria are effective for one's entire body, that you could jump in to the Chametz Tiveria and it will make your whole body pure, certainly it should make your hands pure, just your hands pure. So Amar Papa says, Papa, look, Bim Koman, if we're talking about the Chametz Tiveria itself, in the spring itself, everyone agrees, as I mentioned a minute ago, when we're talking about the Chametz Tiveria itself, everyone agrees you can go to the mikveh in okay, fine. Wait, what is? I'm sorry. Give me a second. The shaper dummy. Okay, fine. Okay, yeah. Again, the chuli amalo kosher amar pavim koman the chuli amalo pliged the shari. Fine. Mishkom minayu b'mana the chuli amalo pliged the asu. Pliged the paskinu. Okay, fine. Okay, let's do that again. Amar pavim says pavim koman the chuli amalo pliged the shari. If we're talking about the Chametz Tiveria itself, everyone agrees. That you can go to the mikveh in the Chametz Tiveria, your whole body, and B, everyone agrees in the Chametz Tiveria itself, you could plunge your hands into the Chametz Tiveria. As we said, if you can go to the mikveh, your whole body in the Chametz Tiveria, also your hands can go into the Chametz Tiveria. Everyone agrees with that. Even Rabbi Yochanan agrees with that. Mishko minayu b'mana. And in terms of, can you fill up a cup with water from the Chametz Tiveria and do netilas yadayim with that? No. Everyone agrees you can't do that. So basically, when it comes to Chametz Tiveria, everyone seems to be on the same page. Chizkiah, Rabbi Yochanan, and that is, you can't fill up a cup and do netilas yadayim. You can tovel your whole body, and you can plunge your hands in. Everyone agrees on all of that. Kiplige, here's where they disagree. The paskinu bivasberta. If the water gets separated into a small little channel, you make a small little channel next to the Chametz Tiveria, and a little bit of water goes into this channel. I believe it's not 40 sa'ah. Right? The Chayz goes of Ramayim Ponim Sham, ain't some sheer mikveh. There's no sheer mikveh. So it's a small little channel. There's enough to plunge your hands into it. There would be enough to fill up a cup and wash your hands from it. So the thing is, once this water, so this is water from the Chamei Tveria that you kind of channeled off into its own little channel. That is where we have a machlokas. It's still connected to the Chamei Tveria, but it's not the main spring. It's a little channel off to the side. Now, and therefore, since it is still the Chamei Tveria, so the same halachos should apply. Namely, you can't do netilas yadayim from the channel because it's hot water, and you can plunge your hands in because it is still the same spring. However, that's where our machlokas is. According to Chizkiah, yeah, that's exactly correct. You could plunge your hands in to this little channel because it is still, in fact, the Chamei Tveria. However, Rabbi Yochanan says you cannot plunge your hands in there because since it is a little channel, it's not obvious that it's part of the Chamei Tveria. If you're plunging your hands into the Chamei Tveria itself, into the spring, so nobody's going to say, oh, well, since you're plunging your hands in there, I must be able to do netilas yadayim from the Chamei Tveria as well. No, it's the Chamei Tveria. It's a spring. It's a hot spring. You can't do netilas yadayim from the Chamei Tveria. You can go to the mikvah in the Chamei Tveria, and because you can go to the mikvah in the Chamei Tveria, you can plunge your hands in there. But once you create this little channel from there, and it's not the actual, it's connected to, but it's not the actual Chamei Tveria, if we allow you to plunge your hands into this little area, then people might think that you can also wash netilas yadayim in this area. They won't realize that you're plunging your hands in there because it's actually still connected to the larger Chamei Tveria. So therefore, Rabbi Yochanan says you can't plunge your hands into this little channel out of concern that you might end up taking a vessel and doing netilas yadayim from that little channel, which is not allowed because the water is hot. Again, kiplige de paskinu bebasberta, where they argue is that if you channel the water into this little channel, marsover gazrina basberta atumana, Rabbi Yochanan says you can't plunge your hands into the little channel out of concern that you might end up, that people might end up doing netilas yadayim from that little channel, which would not be okay. Umarsover lo gazrinan, whereas Chizkiah is not concerned, and he says you could plunge your hands in there. It's part of the Chamei Tveria. But what about people might have been doing netilas yadayim from there? It is not a concern. Kitanoi, like we learned in a brisa, ma'im shenifselu mishtias behema. Water that became so disgusting that even a dog won't eat it. So technically, you can still go to the mikveh in that. If you have a spring, or a mikveh, and it's nasty, it's still a spring or a mikveh, and you can go to the mikveh in there. I hope you have some kind of a shower after that or something. But a spring is a spring and a mikveh is a mikveh. You can go to the mikveh in there. You can plunge your hands in there. But you would be unable to do netilas yadayim with that water because the Chachamim said, right, lo tiknu rabbanon ela beru'uyin l'shtiyas behema. When the Rabbanan made the takana of netilas yadayim, it is only for water that animals would drink. A water that is so disgusting that a dog or another animal would not drink, those are unusable for netilas yadayim. So now, kitanai mayim shenifselu mishtiyas behema, water that's so disgusting that an animal would not drink it, bekelim psulim. In terms of netilas yadayim from a vessel, pasul. Bekarket ksherin. But in the ground, keilu, if it's a mikvah or a spring, even though it's disgusting, it is nonetheless kosher. Reb Shimon ben Elazar almost says, Reb Shimon ben Elazar, af bekarka, even when we're talking about in the ground, a spring or a mikvah, tova b'en kol gufo, you can tovel your whole body in there, avalo panav yodav v'raglav, but not your hands. You can't plunge your hands in there. Again, hashtu kol gufo tova b'en panav yodav v'raglav lo kol shken. If this mikvah or spring is able to purify his whole body, certainly can purify his hands. Elalav de paskinu b'vasberta. Again, we're talking about where this water was channeled into a little channel. Uvapligia, the machlekes is the marsover gazrinan basberta atu mana. It was Reb Shimon ben Gamliel Reb Shimon Elazar. He's concerned that if you, again, right, like we said earlier with the channel, if you plunge your hands in there, people might think you can also do Netilas Yadayim from there. They won't realize it's because it's still connected to the other part of the spring or the mikvah. Whereas the Tanakama is not concerned, and he says you can plunge your hands into this channel. We're not concerned that you're going to do Netilas Yadayim from the channel. Okay, so we learned some very, very interesting things there. We learned about plunging your hands in a mikvah, totally acceptable way and alternative to Netilas Yadayim. And we also learned some things about Netilas Yadayim, which is that when the rabbis enacted and instituted Netilas Yadayim, they excluded hot water, and and that means specifically like Chame Tiberia, which are always hot, inherently hot, are never not hot. And they excluded as well water that an animal would not drink. But otherwise, you can use kind of regular water, and you can always plunge your hands into a mikvah or a ma'ayan. And now we discuss the reason for why we wash our hands for bread. And this is something we discussed yesterday, we discussed in the past, but we're going to see really the source for it now. Amr Bidi bar Avin, Amr Rav Yitzchak bar Ashiyon, Netilas Yadayim lechulin nipnei srach truma. The reason why we wash our hands for chulin, specifically for bread of chulin, is out of concern for truma. Like we discussed yesterday, that kohanim, when they eat truma, it's a Mishnah Masechta Chagiga that says kohanim, before they eat truma, they have to wash their hands. Stam yodayim shnios letuma hein. By default, we assume that your hands have a status of being sheni letumas. A sheni letuma, when touching truma, will be posel truma, and because this is only a truma midirabanan, if we knew for sure that you're right there that you're tummy, that's a different story. But this is a default status that we assign to people of having a status of your hands being sheni letumas, and therefore the Chachamim said, "Why do netilas yadayim before eating truma?" Now, to sort of make sure that the kohanim would be in the habit of and be in the custom of doing netilas yadayim before eating truma, they said everybody should always do netilas yadayim before eating bread. And the Mishnah Berurah says because truma was primarily in the form of bread, it was a lot of grain. Grain would then be consumed as bread. So therefore, the main concern when it comes to truma and making sure that kohanim are going to do netilas yadayim before eating truma would be before eating bread. The Chacham said, the Rabbanan said, everybody, Yisrael's, Levi's, Kohanim, everybody. And I think by now we could safely say, at least in my experience, everybody washes netilas yadayim before eating bread. That's a pretty widely accepted practice. And by doing so, everybody will be in that habit, including the kohanim. So therefore, the reason why we wash our hands, even for chulin, is out of concern to make sure that the kohanim will be washing their hands for truman. And for another reason, this is like a little bit tricky to, not tricky at all, but just tricky to understand, like how to, like, it's a weird thing. Okay, ve'od mishum mitzvah. And more so because of a mitzvah. My mitzvah, what mitzvah? And because of the mitzvah to listen to divrei chachamim. So the reason why we wash our hands before chulin is out of concern for truma, and more so because it's a mitzvah to listen to the chacham. That's why we do it. Okay, so Tosfos says, and again, the trickiness isn't actually in it being tricky at all. It's just it's like the technical semantics of it. But Tosfos says, like, what's the deal with the ve'od? It sounds like there's a second reason over here, and yet it just says mishum mitzvah, mishum mitzvah shema divrei chacham. Tosfos says geishlomar detiknu mishum nikiyus ve'od, and more so. What's the more so? Because of nikiyus, as cleanliness. And these are the two reasons brought down in the Mishnah Berurah for why we do wash our hands before eating bread. Cleanliness, like Tosfos adds as the ve'od here in the Gemara, and also for the concern about Truma. So let's read this again. Rav Idi bar Oven says, Rav Idi bar Oven, Rav Yitzchak bar Ashiyan, Netilas Yadayim l'chulim mipnei suach Truma. The reason why we do Netilas Yadayim before eating bread is out of concern for Truma. Ve'od, and for another reason, Tosfos says, what's this other reason? For just general cleanliness. So those are the two reasons. And Mishum mitzvah, because of a mitzvah. My mitzvah, what mitzvah? Marabai mitzvah l'shma divrei chacham. It's a mitzvah to listen to what the chachamim say, right? What is it? Apia Torah she'irucha v'amitzvah sher yagid l'cha ta'isur or something. Lo sasur min hadavar asher yagid l'cha yom l'smo something, right? Something like that. Lo sasur. The pasuk says you got to listen to the chacham. Chacham said wash your hands, so we do. Rava Amar says Rava mitzvah l'shma divrei. Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch. Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch, Chevra. Does that name get anybody excited? This is a rare find. I don't remember Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch coming up since Masechta Shabbos, Daf Kuf Mem Zayin. I could totally be wrong, but Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch is a rare name to find, and a very significant name to find. A very precious name to find. Why is Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch such a very precious name to find? Who can tell me? It's because the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos, famous Mishnah in Pirkei Avos. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai had 5 students. Those 5 students, let's see if I can remember. Rabbi Yoshua ben Chananya, Rabbi Yoshua, Rabbi Eliezer ben Hurkanus, Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yossi HaKohen, which is not Rabbi Yossi, who was a Talmud of Akiva. This is a different Rabbi Yossi HaKohen, doesn't come up very often. Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua come up often enough, not as often as Rabbi Akiva and his students, but they certainly come up. Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua. Rabbi Yossi HaKohen does not really come up much. And Rabbi Shimon, I don't remember what his name was. Like Rabbi Shimon, I don't remember. Rabbi Shimon something. I don't remember what his name was. And Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch. Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch. Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch. I feel like I'm going to get stuck now on the Rabbi Shimon, but I think it's Rabbi Shimon something. I'll go upon him. Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch was a student of Rabbi Yochanan, the great Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, and it says there that he would list their shvach, and who was kind of the top pupil of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai? Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch. Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch, he was the top student of the great Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. So what happened to Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch? Of course, Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua went on, and we hear all about them. What happened to the great Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch, the top student of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai? So the Gemara in Shabbos at Kuf Mem Zayin says that he ended up getting involved in he got addicted to some kind of a very addictive wine, and he kind of fell out of life. It says there he got an aliyah, and they were reading Parshas Bo HaChodesh Hazeh Lochem, and he read it Hacheresh Haya Libam, that their hearts were deaf. And anyways, he kind of fell out. So it's so special, to have a spotting of Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch in the Gemara. He's like, it's like a Zakin Shachach Tamudo kind of thing. It's like, whoa, he's already Zakin Shachach Tamudo. I don't know. Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch, it's special to see Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch. As the pasuk says in the pasuk, so the pasuk says by Azab that anybody who Azab touches, and he's got to wash his hands. Okay, I think simple pshat in the pasuk is anybody who a zav touches and the zav hasn't yet washed his hands. There's a question bichlal of why it says washing your hands. After all, he has to go to the mikvah, not just wash his hands. There's different explanations for that. And Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch says, Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch mikan samchu chachamim lenetilas yadayim min Torah, and from here the chachamim were somech on netilas yadayim min Torah. We'll explain this in a second. But says Rava that it's a mitzvah. What's the mitzvah here? By netilas yadayim, the mitzvah to listen to Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch, and that he says that the asmachta for netilas yadayim, that we wash our hands before bread, is from this pasuk by a zav b'chol sheiga bo azav v'yadav lo shatav ba'moim. Amalei Rav Rav Nachman says Rav to Rav Nachman, my mashma How does this pasuk teach us about netilas yadayim? The pasuk says, and this is a drasha. V'yadav lo shatav b'mayim. So the pasuk says that the person who, I understand it to mean the person who was touched by a zav. So a zav is an avatuma. If a zav touches somebody, that person becomes a rishon l'tumah, and he's got to go to the mikveh, and he's got to put his clothing in the mikveh as well. So a shatav tor, what? So is that to imply that if a person is touched by a zav, so v'yadav shatav, he just needs to wash his hands? That's it. You get right? Right? We don't understand it that way. Anybody who's touched by a zav, v'yadav lo shatav b'mayim, and he needs to wash his hands. What? Washing his hands is the trick. Hatvila bay, he's got to go to the mikveh. This is what the pasuk is saying. Ve'acher shelo shatav tameh. The pasuk is talking about two things, according to the drasha. Anybody who is touched by a zav becomes tameh. But not only that, v'yadav lo shatav b'mayim. You know who else is tameh? One person who's tameh is a person who a zav touches a person becomes tameh. Who else is tameh? V'yadav lo shatav b'mayim is tameh. A person who hasn't washed his hands is tameh. Stam yadayim shnios l'tumah ein. V'yadav lo shatav b'mayim. A person who has not washed his hands is tameh. So therefore, it sets an asmachta for the requirement to wash our hands in the Torah. That if you haven't washed your hands, you are tameh, and therefore that is why we need to wash our hands before eating truma, or we said, the Chacham said, even before eating chulin, out of concern for truma. And now we discuss washing hands, doing netilas yadayim for fruit, and some other interesting adjacent topics. Omar Reb Elazar, Omar Reb Oshaya, lo amru netilas yadayim lepeiris elim shum nekiyas. The reason why we say to wash our hands to do netilas yadayim for fruit is for cleanliness reasons. So Ramina chovu deleka hamitzvah. So the understanding was there is no obligation to do netilas yadayim before eating fruit, but it is nonetheless a mitzvah. It is a good thing to do. Amar lu Rava. Rava says to them, lo chova v'lo mitzvah l'rishos. No, it's not an obligation, nor is it even a good thing to do. But you can wash your hands. You can do netilas yadayim before eating fruit if you want to. Fliga Rav Nachman, which argues Rav Nachman, anota yadav lepeiris enu elim migasei haruach. That a person who washes his hands for fruit is a haughty fellow. The Rambam adds a word there, which for me changed my whole relationship with this concept. I was always a little bit, didn't really understand, it didn't click for me, this idea of doing netilas yadayim for fruits is migasei haruach. Like, why fruits, whatever. But I think now, learning the daf now, I think I understand it better. The Rambam adds the word for chulin, for peiris chulin, which just drove something home for me. Meaning, we're talking about fruits that are chulin. There's no need to do netilas yadayim for chulin. You have to do netilas yadayim for truma. Now, we said when it came to bread, so Chacham say, even though you're eating bread that is chulin, so normally, right, there's no need to do netilas yadayim for chulin. But when it comes to bread, out of a concern for truma and the kohanim, and most truma being bread, that was the Mishnah Berurah said that. So the Chacham said when it comes to bread, even though it's chulin, do netilas yadayim nonetheless. They didn't say that by fruit. And anybody who does netilas yadayim is makbid to do netilas yadayim before eating a fruit, which is chulin, is a little bit overdoing it, and they're considered haughty. Says Rabbi Chana Avakaimno Kame de Rabbi Ami Rabasi. He says, I was before Rabbi Ami Rabasi. I saw the Kamayu Kalkal de Peri, and fruits, a basket of fruits was brought before them. V'achlu, and they were eating fruit. V'lo mashu yadayu, they did not wash their hands before eating the fruit. V'lo yavulim v'lo midi. Secondly, they didn't offer me any. And thirdly, uvarich chad lechude. And thirdly, they made a bracha acharona separately. And Shmamina tlas, and I learned three things from that story. Shmamina, the first thing that I learned from that story is that, as Rav Nachman said, we don't wash our hands before eating fruits. Rabami and Rabasi did not wash their hands before eating the fruit. Vishmamina, the second thing I learned was Ein mezamnin ala peris. We don't make a zimun on fruits. The Shulchan Aruch says that it's mashma from this Gemara, the point being that if it was bread, for example, so bread, shlosha shachlu ka'achas, chayav nezamin. Right, 3 people who eat together, they have to make a zimun. And not only that, if bread, 3 people eat bread together, have to make a zimun. Now, not only that, if there's only 2 people eating bread, but there's a third person there, they'll request from the third person to join them so that they can make a zimun. Because a zimun is a good thing. You could say, Rabbi Sanivarich, let's bless together. Let's come together to bless the Rabbeinu Shalom. That's better than making brachas individually. If you can come together, so then that is better. So therefore, when it comes to bread, if there are 2 people, they would pull in the third person. Now, if there was a mitzvah by zimun, by fruit, so they would have pulled in Rabbi Bar Chana as well to join them so that they can make a zimun, but they didn't pull him in. So it says of Rabbi Bar Chana, so clearly when it comes to fruits, there's no mitzvah of zimun, because if there was, they would have invited me in. Bishmamina, and thirdly, shnaim she'achlu mitzvah leichalik, that when 2 people eat together, it is better that they say a bracha achrona separately rather than one person to say it for the other. You see, so this is very interesting because when it comes to a bracha rishona, it is there is a certain preference that one person should make the bracha for everybody else, because brova madras melech. Now, as the Ramah points out in the Shulchan Aruch, we only do this for bread now, as I'm sure we all do this, right? Tonight's Shabbos. I'm sure there's a good chance that will be at a place where one person will make the bracha on hamotzi and everybody else will listen and say amen. And yet, when it comes to benching, so there will be a zimun, but let's not talk about that for now. But if you have 2 people eating together and they're eating bread, you can have one person make a bracha for the other person. The other person will be yotze, but when it comes to benching afterwards, they should each bench on their own. Why is that? Tosfos says because at the beginning of the Suda, everyone's coming together. Right, especially you can imagine, right, at Shabbos table, everyone washed, everyone's quiet. There's anticipation. The person who's making a bracha on the bread is now going to be matir everyone to eat, to start the meal, to be able to talk. There's anticipation. Everybody's coming together for the Suda at the beginning, and therefore they're kind of joining together for the bracha. And one person can be motzi everybody else. At the end of the Suda, when everybody's about to go their separate ways, there isn't that same level of joining together, and therefore everybody benches on their own. So now, even when it comes to benching, and even if there are 3 people, and you do make a zimun, and therefore you really are coming together, and preferably really one person should, if there's a zimun, if there's bread and you're making a zimun, you should have one person making a bracha for everybody. But nonetheless, nowadays, because we can't focus so good, really what you want is that the person leading the zimun would kind of be leading the zimun, like the chazan of the zimun, and leading it, and he would be leading, and everybody would be kind of saying it quietly to themselves along with that person. But I think practically what ends up happening is that everyone's just kind of doing their own thing. But at least for the first bracha, says the Ramah or the Mishnah Rura based on the Ramah, the mizamen should be saying at least the first bracha out loud, because that's the Ramah says that's the end of the birkas hazimun, and then the rest, everyone can kind of do their own thing if necessary. So what did we see over here? So we said that we see by Rabbi Amir Rav Asi that they each did their own bracha acharona. So even though by bracha rishona they can come together, and they were only eating peiros here, but still the Shulchan Aruch says that when it comes to peiros also, if they were eating together, then one person can be motzei the other when it comes to bracha rishona. However, the Ramah says we don't do it for fruits, but they were doing it for fruits. But when it comes to bracha acharona, they nonetheless made their own separate brachas, as we said, as Tosfos said, because by bracha rishona they're coming together, whereas bracha acharona they're about to separate, which is very, very interesting. We also in a Bryce like this, that if you have two people eating, mitzvah lechalik, it is a mitzvah for them to separate for the bracha achrona. When is this? If they both know how to bench, so they should both bench separately. But if one of them doesn't know how to bench, so then so then the one who knows how to bench should be motzi the one who does not know how to bench. So to review quickly the three things, so ein netilas yadayim leperes, there's no netilas yadayim for pears, ein mezamnin ala pears, we don't make a zimun for pears, and shnayim she'achlu mitzvah lechalek, that when it comes to bracha achrona, it is a mitzvah better to do that separately than together. And the Gemara now wraps up with just some practical considerations for how to do netilas yadayim. Tanarabban the Rabbi said netilas yadayim lechulin, netilas yadayim for chulin, ada perek. Rashi understands this to mean just the middle section of the finger, the middle knuckle of the fingers. The truma, now for truma, it's a little bit more chamor. Ad perek is till the next knuckles, the knuckles on the back of your hand. Kiddush yadayim v'raglayim b'mikdash, and in terms of washing your hands and feet in the Beis Hamikdash before doing avodah for the kohanim, ad perek, that is until the wrist. Okay, so for chulin, it's until kind of the second knuckle on your fingers, the middle, right in the middle of your fingers. For truma, it's till the knuckles on the back of your hand. And for Kiddush Yadayim V'Raglayim in the Beis Hamikdash, it's still your wrist. The whole davar shechotzes batvila baguf chotzes b'netilas yadayim l'chulin, and anything that would constitute a chatzitza, a separation between the waters of the mikvah and your body when it comes to going to the mikvah, anything that would constitute a chatzitza for mikvah would be a chatzitza for netilas yadayim as well. L'chulin. Uvi Kiddush Yadayim V'Raglayim b'Mikdash, as well as for Kiddush Yadayim V'Raglayim in the Beis HaMikdash, we have to be concerned about those chatzitzas. Amar Rav says, Rav, Adkan l'chulin, Adkan l'truma. Rav would point out, as we had said, until the middle knuckle for chulin, till the knuckle on the back of your hands for truma. Ushmuel Amar Adkan bein l'chulin, bein l'truma, l'chumra. Shmuel, however, said that it's the same point, both for chulin and for truma, lechumra, i.e., if you only have to wash to the middle of your fingers, or to the back of your hand, the knuckles on the back of your hand. So says Shmuel that both for chulin and for truma you have to wash until the knuckles on the back of your hand. Rav Sheshes Zamar Adkan bein lechulin bein letruma lekula. Whereas Rav Sheshes says it's the same thing for chulin and for truma, but to be more lenient, just till the middle knuckles. Omar Bahedje says Bahedje Avokoimna Kami Derbami Vabasi says. The comment of Rabbi Bahedje says, I was before Rabbi Ami, and he said, Adkan v'adkan l'chulin bein l'chumra, bein l'chulin bein l'truma l'chumra. And Rabbi Ami said, like Shmuel, that both for chulin and for truma, it's more stringent, i.e., to the knuckles on the back of your hand. And don't say Rabbi Ami mishum dekoyenu. Don't say that Rabbi Ami was just more stringent because he is actually a kohen. And therefore, to get in the hang of it, to get in the habit of always washing his hands until the knuckles in the back of his hand, because that's what's necessary for truma. Now, by the way, there's an interesting question I was thinking of. Why was Rabbi Ami eating truma? He was a kohen, sure, but he's an amora, which means it was post Beis HaMikdash. Wouldn't he be tamei tumas hameis? How could he be eating truma? So I found Taka and Daf Lamed Aleph. I somehow found when we learned Daf Lamed Aleph. So was that 2 months ago or so? There's a note on the side of the page by somebody named Marav Ranchberg who says, "The bimea amoroim hayu ochlin truma tehora be'eretz Yisrael." Rabbi Ami was in Eretz Yisrael. Ki haya loim efer para. Did you hear that? They still had the ashes of the para aduma. I guess it lasted for a bit. They still had ashes of the para aduma, so I wonder if that's the point. Rabbi Ami was still able to eat truma because he had ashes of the para aduma. And so don't say that Rabbi Ami was just being stringent and saying till the knuckles on the back of his hand because he was a kohen and he actually ate truma, so even for chulin, he was machmir. No. Deha, Rav Miasha bar Breda Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, what? Oh, okay, fine. Deha Rav Miasha bar Breda Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, who is the grandson of Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, Levoi, he was a Levi. V'amar adkan bein lechulin, bein lechuma lechumra. And he also, even though he was not a Kohen, he said that you have to wash your hands for Netilas Yadayim up until the knuckles on the back of your hand. Okay, fine. So interestingly, from the Gemara, at least the way that Rashi was explaining it, that Netilas Yadayim for Truma and for Chulin, right? So essentially we're saying we're being machmir to go to the knuckles on the back of your hand. Now, according to the Shulchan Aruch, the way so the Rosh paskins like this, but the Shulchan Aruch points out to the Rif in Masechta Brachos, who says that no, you really need to wash your whole wrist, and the Shulchan Aruch says that you should really be machmir for that, to wash your whole wrist, and I think that is what we do. Practically speaking, when we wash Netilas Yadayim, we, especially for food, for bread, we wash our entire hand up until our wrist. Chevre, that was Daf Kuf Vav, Daf 106 of Masechta Chulin. Daf Kuf Vav Masechta Chulin I found to be a very interesting daf because there were all these little, small, but very, very foundational, practical nuggets here on Daf Kuf Vav. For example, that you can plunge your hands into a ma'ayan or into a mikvah as an alternative to doing Netilas Yadayim. Very, very interesting. We learned about the reason for washing our hands for bread, as we learned about in the past. We saw in the Gemara today and in Tosfos 2 reasons. One is to get in the habit, particularly for Kohanim, to be washing their hands before bread, so that they will also be in the habit of washing their hands before Truma Memele. And also, as Tosfos pointed out, as a sign of cleanliness. We also saw in that context Reb Elazar ben Aruch, which was a very exciting spotting in the Gemara. We learned about washing our hands for fruit, the famous sheet of Rav Nachman, that anybody washes their hands for fruit is migase aruach, is haughty, because fruit of chulin, there is no din derabanan to wash your hands for fruit, and if you do, you're just being haughty. And we then learned about some interesting halachas with regards to Birkas Hamazon and Zimun, namely that Zimun is specifically for bread, it is not for fruit. We also learned along the way, we learned the difference between a bracha rishona and a bracha acharona, in that when it comes to a bracha rishona, there is a preference for one person to be motzi other people, brova madras melech. Now, in practice, according to the Shulchan Aruch, we only do that for bread these days, as we are familiar with from Shabbos. And the reason why there's a preference for one person to make a bracha for everybody else is because everyone's coming together at the beginning of the Suda, as opposed to at the end. We say that there is no such preference to make a bracha for everybody else, because everyone's kind of going on their own way. We did discuss a little bit in that context, though, when it comes to a zimun is an exception, that if 3 people ate together, first of all, we said that if 2 people ate together and there's another person there, if they're eating bread, it's preferable to pull that person in so that they could make a zimun and say nivarech, and that way come together. And really from learning the Shulchan Aruch and having another look at the Shulchan Aruch and the Mishnah Berurah, really when we come together to make a zimun, we are really doing just that. We're really coming together. And there's really a preference, ideally, that you would have the mezamin is like the chazan of the zimun, and he would be benching for everybody, and everybody would just be listening. However, nowadays, so that everybody can focus better, everybody says it along with the mezamin, but there is still kind of a preference that I think, in my experience, what ends up happening is everyone's kind of off to the races. But really, I think when it comes to zimun, there is a concept and a preference that the mezamin is like the chazan, and he should be saying the whole benching out loud, and everybody, even though nowadays everybody says their own benching, but should be saying it along with the chazan, with the mezamin quietly. But I think practically we don't do that. Everyone just kind of does their own thing. And says the Mishnah Berurah, at the very least, the mezamin should say the first bracha out loud, which is always an interesting thing. I'm always was never clear about what exactly, where do I stop as the mezamin. So really it seems that the idea is, at least for the first bracha, because that's the end of the Birkas Hazimun, the mezamin should be saying it out loud, and ideally the people would be reading along with him rather than kind of everybody off to the races, which I thought was just some very interesting halachas, practical halachas to pick up along the way. And finally, we learned about Netilas Yadayim in our Gemara over here, Lefi Perish Rashi. I do want to have another look at Tosfos over here. There might be some practical stuff here in Tosfos, but Lefi Shittas Rashi, and as the Shulchan Aruch paskin based on the rush, that when it comes to washing your hands before bread, you're going to want to wash up to your knuckles. However, the Shulchan Aruch prefers the opinion of the Rif in Masechta Brachos, which is that you should be washing your hands up to your wrists. Friends, that was Daf Kuf Vav of Masechta Chullin. Very, very exciting daf, in my opinion, in a very tsanua, humble way. It was a very beautiful daf. I hope you have a beautiful Shabbos. Have a great day, a great Shabbos. Cheers.